Welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we are covering a world that is rapidly fragmenting into armed camps. We've got a U.S. naval blockade choking the Strait of Hormuz, Pakistani fighter jets deploying to Saudi Arabia, China's strategic thinkers openly comparing our era to ancient China's warring states period, a South Korean president drawing Holocaust parallels that have ignited a diplomatic firestorm, and Brazil's 80-year-old president doing leg presses on livestream to prove he can survive another term. Every one of these stories connects to a single through line: the old global order is cracking apart, and the powerful are scrambling to position themselves in whatever comes next.
And that's exactly what makes tonight's broadcast essential, Alex. Because mainstream coverage treats each of these stories as isolated incidents. Lula's workout videos get filed under quirky political moments. The Hormuz blockade gets sanitized as strategic posturing. But when you lay them side by side, a pattern emerges that should concern every single person watching. We are witnessing the architecture of the post-World War II international system, the rules, the norms, the institutions, being dismantled in real time. And the people dismantling it are betting that you won't connect the dots.
Let's start with the most immediately dangerous story on our board tonight. The United States has imposed a naval blockade on Iranian ports and coastal areas along the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. U.S. Central Command announced this will take effect Monday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Now, let's be absolutely clear about what a naval blockade is under international law. It is an act of war. Full stop. You blockade a nation's ports, you are waging economic warfare that starves civilians, disrupts medicine, cuts off fuel. The U.S. is simultaneously claiming it won't impede vessels crossing the Strait of Hormuz to other nations, but analysts quoted by the South China Morning Post are already warning that distinction is functionally meaningless in practice.
And here's what the mainstream coverage is burying, Alex. This blockade doesn't just pressure Iran. It destabilizes the entire global energy market. 21% of the world's petroleum passes through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. That's roughly 21 million barrels. When you militarize that choke point, insurance premiums on tankers skyrocket, shipping routes get rerouted, and the cost gets passed directly to consumers in Europe, Asia, and Africa. The people who pay the price for this so-called strategic advantage are not sitting in the Pentagon. They're filling up their cars in Mumbai and heating their homes in Berlin.
And the timing here is critical. This blockade comes while a ceasefire was supposedly in effect. Analysts are explicitly warning that this increased pressure on Iran may call that ceasefire into question. So ask yourself, who benefits from torpedoing a ceasefire? Because it's certainly not the Iranian civilians who've been living under crushing sanctions for years. It's not the sailors on commercial vessels who now have to navigate a militarized strait. The beneficiaries are defense contractors, the geopolitical hawks who've wanted regime change in Tehran for decades, and anyone who profits from elevated oil prices. Follow the money. Always follow the money.
Which brings us directly to the Pakistani jet story, because these two developments are not separate events. They are coordinated moves on the same chessboard. Pakistan has deployed an Air Force contingent to a base on Saudi Arabia's Gulf Coast. The South China Morning Post reports this deployment is described as purely defensive. But let's unpack what purely defensive means when you park fighter jets within striking distance of Iran while simultaneously mediating peace talks between Tehran and Washington. Pakistan is trying to be both the referee and a player on one of the teams.
This is an extraordinary tightrope walk, Maya. Pakistan has historically maintained a careful balancing act between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Both are critical relationships. Iran shares a border with Pakistan. Saudi Arabia provides billions in financial support and employs millions of Pakistani workers. But this deployment fundamentally changes the calculus. The South China Morning Post quotes analysts saying this forces Tehran to ask a pointed question: if hostilities resume, is Iran prepared to risk shooting down warplanes belonging to the country that's supposed to be brokering peace? That's not defensive posturing. That's coercive diplomacy with a military backbone.
And what nobody is talking about is what Pakistan gets out of this arrangement. Because Pakistan doesn't deploy fighter jets to foreign bases out of charity. This is almost certainly tied to financial packages, energy agreements, and security guarantees from Riyadh. Pakistan's economy has been in crisis. The IMF has been breathing down their neck. Saudi Arabia has historically provided emergency financial lifelines to Islamabad. So when you see Pakistani jets on a Saudi airfield, you're not just seeing a military deployment. You're seeing the transactional nature of modern alliance systems laid bare. Security for sale, mediation with an asterisk.
And this is where the China story becomes the intellectual framework for everything else we're discussing tonight. The South China Morning Post reports that strategic elites in Beijing have started to see world politics as sliding from what they call the spring and autumn period into the warring states era. For viewers who aren't familiar with Chinese history, the warring states period was a time of total fragmentation, shifting alliances, constant military conflict, and the eventual unification of China under a single authoritarian power. When Beijing's top thinkers use this framework, they're telling you what they believe is coming.
And the critical insight from this analysis is what it says about China's own strategy. The article argues that China's future will depend less on economic power and more on presenting what they call a reliable political vision. For a decade, the dominant framework was Graham Allison's Thucydides trap, the idea that a rising power and an established power are destined for conflict. But Beijing is now moving beyond that framework. They're not just preparing for potential conflict with the United States. They're positioning themselves as an alternative center of gravity for a world that's losing faith in American leadership.
And this is the part that should keep you up at night. Because when Beijing looks at the Hormuz blockade, they don't just see a US-Iran confrontation. They see confirmation of their thesis. They see an America that uses its naval dominance to strangle economies, that militarizes global commons, that breaks ceasefires when it's strategically convenient. And Beijing is offering an alternative narrative to the global South: we trade, we build infrastructure, we don't blockade your ports. Now, China has its own massive human rights problems and its own imperial ambitions, but the propaganda contrast writes itself. And Washington is handing them the script.
This is exactly the dynamic the Warring States framework predicts, Alex. In the original Warring States period, the states that survived weren't necessarily the most militarily powerful. They were the ones that built the most effective alliances and presented the most compelling governing philosophy. China is studying this history and applying it directly to geopolitics. Meanwhile, the United States is acting like the state of Qin, relying on raw military force, without recognizing that Qin's unification came at the cost of massive instability and eventually collapsed within 15 years. Brute force is not a long-term strategy.
Now let's turn to the South Korean president's remarks, because this story is a case study in how truth gets weaponized depending on who speaks it. President Lee Jae-myung compared Israeli military actions against Palestinians to the Holocaust. He said the wartime killings by the Israel Defense Forces were, and I'm quoting directly, no different from the Jewish massacre by the Nazis. He also reposted footage with a caption that reportedly showed Israeli troops torturing and throwing a Palestinian from the roof of a building. Israel's response was immediate and furious.
And here's where we need to be precise, because this story has multiple layers of uncomfortable truth that nobody wants to sit with. First, the factual layer. The International Court of Justice has found plausible grounds that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. The International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for Israeli leaders. Multiple human rights organizations, including Israeli ones like B'Tselem, have documented systematic abuses. So when President Lee draws comparisons to historical atrocities, he is not speaking from a vacuum. He is referencing documented findings from the highest international legal bodies on the planet.
But the second layer is equally important. Holocaust comparisons are a specific rhetorical weapon, and using them carries consequences that go beyond accuracy. Israel has recalled diplomatic staff. There are reports of domestic criticism within South Korea. The question isn't just whether the comparison is factually supportable, it's why a newly elected South Korean president chose this particular moment, this particular language, and this particular platform to make it. And I think the answer connects directly to the Warring States thesis. Lee is signaling to the global South and to domestic audiences that South Korea under his leadership will not be a silent partner in American-backed conflicts.
That's a crucial observation. Because Lee Jae-myung is a progressive who won the presidency after the political crisis surrounding his predecessor. He's repositioning South Korea's foreign policy identity. And making this statement puts him in alignment with the vast majority of the global South, which has been overwhelmingly critical of Israel's military operations. It distances Seoul from Washington on a critical issue. And it plays exceptionally well domestically with younger Korean voters who have been highly engaged in pro-Palestinian advocacy. This isn't impulsive. This is calculated foreign policy repositioning disguised as moral outrage.
And look at the Israeli response. The diplomatic row, the outcry, the immediate framing of Lee's comments as anti-Semitic rather than engaging with the documented evidence he referenced. This is the playbook. Any comparison to historical atrocities gets deflected as offensive rather than addressed on its merits. But here's the reality that Israel's diplomatic apparatus cannot wish away. When the ICJ, the ICC, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and B'Tselem are all documenting the same patterns of systematic violence, the problem isn't the people drawing comparisons. The problem is the conduct being compared.
And this brings us to what might seem like the lightest story of the night, but is actually deeply revealing about the state of democracy itself. Brazil's President Lula da Silva, who is 80 years old, is live streaming his gym workouts to prove he's physically fit to run for a historic fourth term. The Guardian reports he's doing lunges, leg presses, and contrasting his vitality with challenger Flavio Bolsonaro, who actually fainted during a televised debate. On the surface, this seems almost comedic. An octogenarian president pumping iron on Instagram. But beneath the surface, this story is about something profoundly troubling.
You're absolutely right, Maya. What we're watching is the complete reduction of democratic legitimacy to spectacle. Lula isn't live streaming workouts because physical fitness is a meaningful qualification for the presidency. He's doing it because modern political campaigns have been reduced to content creation. The medium is the message. And the message is, forget my policies, forget my track record, forget the corruption scandals, forget the economic data, look at my biceps. This is what democracy looks like when social media algorithms determine political viability. Your ability to go viral matters more than your ability to govern.
And the specific context here is crucial. Lula is seeking a historic fourth term. Brazil's constitution was amended to allow this. He's an octogenarian running against Flavio Bolsonaro, son of former President Jair Bolsonaro, who represents the far-right movement that literally attempted to storm Brazil's government buildings in January 2023. So Brazilian voters are being asked to choose between a geriatric leftist who proves his worth through workout videos and a dynastic far-right candidate who fainted on live television. This is the caliber of choice that the world's fourth-largest democracy is being offered. And nobody in mainstream media is asking why.
Because asking why would require confronting an uncomfortable truth about democracy globally. We're seeing the same pattern everywhere. In the United States, in Brazil, in multiple European nations, the candidate pool is narrowing to the very old, the very dynastic, or the very performative. Often all three simultaneously. Lula's workout videos aren't just Brazilian political theater. They're a symptom of a global democratic crisis where institutional legitimacy has been so thoroughly eroded that leaders must literally perform their fitness for office in the most physical, literal sense of the word.
And here's the connection to the broader power patterns we've been tracing tonight. While Lula is doing leg presses for the camera, Brazil is navigating one of the most complex geopolitical moments in its history. The Hormuz blockade will affect Brazilian energy markets. China's warring states positioning directly impacts Brazil as a BRICS nation. The question of how nations respond to the Israel-Palestine situation shapes Brazil's relationships across the global south. These are the issues that should define a presidential campaign. Instead, we're counting reps.
Let's pull the threads together now, because the picture that emerges when you connect these 5 stories is genuinely alarming. You have the United States imposing an act of war on Iran through a naval blockade while a ceasefire is supposed to be in effect. You have Pakistan deploying fighter jets to Saudi Arabia while simultaneously claiming to mediate peace, effectively monetizing its role as peacemaker. You have China's strategic class openly preparing for a world of permanent great power conflict. You have a South Korean president breaking ranks with the Western consensus on Israel in a calculated bid to reposition his nation. And you have Brazil's democratic process reduced to a fitness influencer competition.
The common thread is the collapse of the institutional frameworks that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of fragmentation. The United Nations cannot enforce its own court's rulings. The international laws governing naval blockades are being ignored. Peace mediation has become a transactional commodity. Democratic elections have become content cycles. And the great powers are openly studying historical periods of fragmentation not as cautionary tales but as strategic playbooks. The warring states framework isn't just an academic metaphor in Beijing. It's becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy because every major actor is behaving as though the old order is already dead.
And what the mainstream media won't tell you is who benefits from this collapse. Because chaos is not neutral. When international institutions fail, power flows to those who already have it, the nations with the biggest militaries, the corporations with the most capital, the political dynasties with the deepest networks. The Hormuz blockade benefits defense contractors and oil speculators. Pakistan's deployment benefits Saudi and Pakistani elites at the expense of regional stability. China's warring states positioning benefits the Chinese Communist Party's grip on power. Li's remarks benefit his domestic political standing. Lula's workouts benefit his personal brand. In every case, the costs are socialized and the benefits are privatized.
And the people who pay those costs are always the same. The Iranian civilians who can't get medicine because of a blockade. The Pakistani soldiers deployed to a foreign base on behalf of financial arrangements they didn't consent to. The Palestinian civilians whose documented suffering gets reduced to a diplomatic talking point. The Brazilian voters whose genuine concerns about their future get answered with a bench press video. The billions of people across the global south who watch the great powers play chess with their lives and livelihoods.
This is why the warring states comparison from Beijing's strategic thinkers is so chilling, Maya. Because in the original warring states period, the civilian death toll was catastrophic. The wars killed millions. Entire populations were displaced. The eventual unification under Qin came through a level of brutality that shocked even contemporary observers. If the world's strategic planners are genuinely adopting this as their operating framework, they are implicitly accepting that level of human cost as the price of the transition. And no one is asking the people who will pay that price whether they consent.
And that's the fundamental democratic failure at the heart of all 5 of these stories. None of these decisions, the blockade, the jet deployment, the strategic repositioning, the diplomatic provocations, the reduction of elections to spectacle, none of them were made with meaningful democratic input from the people most affected. They were made by elites, for elites, using the language of security, stability, and national interest to justify actions that primarily serve concentrated power. The old order may have been imperfect, deeply imperfect, but at least it maintained the fiction that ordinary people had a voice. That fiction is being abandoned.
So here's our call to action, and I mean this with everything I've got. Do not let these stories wash over you as separate headlines. The blockade, the jets, the warring states framework, the Holocaust comparison, the workout videos, they are all chapters of the same story. The story of a world where the powerful have decided that the rules no longer apply to them and are racing to grab what they can before anyone else does. Your job, our job, is to refuse to let that happen in silence.
Read the South China Morning Post's analysis of the warring states framework. Read The Guardian's coverage of Brazil but ask the questions they're not asking. Follow the ICJ and ICC proceedings, not the diplomatic outrage cycles. Track where Pakistani military assets are deployed and ask who's paying for it. And above all, demand that your own leaders, whoever they are, wherever you are, explain how their actions serve you, not the defense contractors, not the oil companies, not the political dynasties. The old order is breaking. What replaces it depends entirely on whether ordinary people demand a seat at the table or accept being served as the meal.
This has been Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth. Stay informed, stay critical, and never stop asking who benefits. We'll see you next time.